There's a country beneath the North Sea. Not a metaphor, not a myth. A country with river systems and ridge lines and lake shores and campsites where human beings lived, hunted, loved, buried their dead, and watched the sun set over grasslands that no longer exist. If you drained the North Sea tomorrow, pulled the plug on the gray water between England and Denmark, you would find it. The contours are still there on the seabed. Sonar surveys have mapped river channels that once carried fresh water to estuaries teeming with fish. Sediment cores have recovered pollen from birch and hazel forests that grew on hills now 40 meters underwater. Fishing trawlers have dragged up the bones of mammoths and the antler harpoons of the people who hunted them. The country had no name. The people who lived there left no writing. No monuments, no cities. They left flint, bone, and the faintest chemical traces of campfires in sediment layers that geologists can date to within a few centuries.
Archaeologists call the country Doggerland after the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank in the middle of the North Sea where British fishing boats have worked for centuries, and where, beginning in the early 20th century, trawler nets began pulling up objects that should not have been on the ocean floor. Antler points, worked flint, a chunk of peat with a barbed bone harpoon embedded in it. In 1931, the trawler Colinda hauled up a lump of moor log, compressed peat from the Lehman and Auerbank, 25 miles off the Norfolk coast, and inside it was a barbed antler point of unmistakable Mesolithic workmanship. The object was 8,000 years old. It had been made on dry land. The University of Birmingham's Europe's Lost Frontiers project, led by archaeologist Vincent Gaffney beginning in 2015, used seismic survey data originally collected by the petroleum industry to build the most detailed map of Doggerland's submerged landscape ever produced. What they found was not a featureless mudflat.
It was a complex, varied, resource-rich environment. A patchwork of wetlands, river valleys, coastal lagoons, and upland areas that would have supported a substantial Mesolithic population for thousands of years. Gaffney's team identified what appeared to be a massive inland lake, a river system comparable to the Rhine, and coastlines with the kind of sheltered inlets that attract human settlement everywhere on Earth. The project recovered ancient DNA from sediment cores, identified shifts in vegetation patterns, and produced models of how the landscape changed as sea levels rose between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 BCE. This was not marginal land at the edge of nowhere. This was the center of the Mesolithic world. I want to take you there. I want to put you on that land before the water came. Wren is not a name anyone would have used.
Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in northern Europe left no written records, and the languages they spoke are lost beyond any hope of reconstruction. But the person I am calling Wren is not imaginary. He is a composite, assembled from the archaeological evidence of how people lived in the final centuries of Doggerland's existence, roughly 6,500 to 6,200 BCE. He is a flintknapper, a seasonal camp organizer, a man in his late 30s, old by the standards of his world, with hands scarred from decades of striking flint nodules into microliths, the tiny geometric blades that Mesolithic people hafted into wooden and bone handles to make composite tools. His world is shrinking. He knows this. Not the way you and I know about sea level rise, not as a data set or a projection or a graph in a report. He knows it the way you know the contour of your own backyard. The creek that used to run dry in summer does not run dry anymore.
The mudflat where his grandmother dug for cockles is underwater at low tide now. The campsite on the south-facing slope above the river, the one his people have used every autumn for as long as anyone can remember, flooded last spring for the first time. The land is sinking, or the sea is rising.
Wren does not have the vocabulary to distinguish between the two, and in practical terms, it does not matter. What matters is that the hunting ground is getting smaller. The reed marsh that attracts waterfowl in spring is expanding into the birch wood. The freshwater lake where his people fish for pike is turning brackish. Every generation in Wren's lineage has known a slightly different coastline. His great-grandfather walked to places Wren cannot reach without a boat. His children will need boats to reach places Wren can still walk. But the change is not fast enough to constitute a single dramatic event. There is no flood, there is no catastrophe, not yet.
There is only the slow, grinding, relentless arithmetic of millimeters per year, compounding across decades, eating land that nobody will remember was ever land. This is the thing about Doggerland that makes it different from every other lost civilization I have ever told you about. The Phoenicians were conquered, the Etruscans were absorbed, the Minoans were shattered by a volcanic eruption. Doggerland was not destroyed by any human act or sudden natural disaster. It was drowned by time, by the patient, indifferent work of meltwater from ice sheets that had been retreating since the last glacial maximum 18,000 years earlier. The people who lived there did not lose a war. They lost a geological argument, and they lost it slowly enough that every generation could see it happening, and fast enough that no generation could stop it. Wren's camp sits on a low ridge above a river estuary. On clear days, he can see the chalk hills to the west, the future cliffs of eastern England, and on very clear days, the faintest blue line of higher ground to the east, the future coast of the Netherlands. Between those two horizons, the land is flat, waterlogged, and alive. Birch and willow crowd the riverbanks. Reed beds stretch for miles along the estuary, dense with nesting birds. Red deer move through the open grassland between the tree cover, following paths that Wren's people have memorized across lifetimes. The camp itself is modest, a cluster of shelters, bent hazel poles covered with hides and bark, arranged around a central hearth. Drying racks for fish and meat, a midden heap of shells, fish bones, broken flint, and fire-cracked stone that has been accumulating for decades.
The camp is seasonal. Wren's people move between 3 or 4 sites in a yearly circuit, following the migrations of deer and fish and waterfowl, arriving at each site when its particular resources peak. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. The logistics of seasonal movement across a landscape that floods unpredictably with a group that includes children and elderly people and everything they own require an intimate knowledge of terrain, weather, animal behavior, and water levels that takes a lifetime to acquire and cannot be written down. It lives in the heads of people like Wren. When Wren dies, his knowledge will survive only if he has successfully transmitted it to someone younger. Through years of walking the same paths, reading the same mud, watching the same sky. The camp's flint supply comes from nodules eroded out of chalk deposits along a river bluff half a day's walk to the northwest. Wren has been working this source since he was a boy.
The chalk here is soft, and the flint inside it is glassy, dark, and fine-grained, ideal for the microliths his people use. A microlith is a small, geometric flint blade, typically less than 3 centimeters long, shaped into a triangle or trapezoid or crescent, and then hafted with birch bark resin into a groove cut along a wooden or bone shaft. A single composite tool might contain a dozen microliths arranged in a row, creating a serrated cutting edge that can be repaired in the field by replacing individual blades. It is an elegant technology. It requires precision, patience, and an understanding of how flint fractures that borders on the intuitive. Wren can produce a usable microlith in under a minute. He can produce a beautiful one in 3. The difference matters to him in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not spent 30 years striking stone.
There is a rightness to a well-made blade, a symmetry, a thinness, a clean fracture surface that catches light, that has nothing to do with function. A crude microlith cuts just as well as a refined one, but Wren makes refined ones anyway, because the making itself is a kind of language, a conversation with the stone, and the quality of the finished product is a statement about who he is and what he values. Archaeological sites across Doggerland and its surviving margins, Star Carr in North Yorkshire, Howick in Northumberland, the submerged landscapes off the coast of the Isle of Wight have yielded Mesolithic tool assemblages of remarkable sophistication. At Star Carr, excavated by Graham Clark in 1949 to 1951 and revisited by a University of York team in the 2000s and 2010s, archaeologists recovered not only thousands of flint microliths, but also barbed bone and antler points, the earliest known evidence of carpentry in Europe in the form of a split timber platform, and 21 red deer skull frontlets, the front portions of deer skulls with antlers still attached, carefully shaped and perforated so they could be worn as headgear. Whether these were hunting disguises, ritual objects, or both remains debated, but their existence tells us that Mesolithic people in this region invested significant time and skill in the manufacture of objects whose function went beyond immediate survival. These were people with a symbolic world. Wren's camp is not Star Carr. Star Carr dates to roughly 9000 BCE, nearly 3,000 years before Wren's time, but the material culture is continuous.
The same traditions of flintworking, boneworking, and seasonal movement that appear at Star Carr persist across the Mesolithic of Northern Europe, adapting to local conditions and changing environments, but recognizably part of the same broad cultural system. Wren inherits a way of life that has been refined over millennia, and that way of life is ending. The spring flood this year was worse than last year's. Wren noticed it first in the midden. The shell heap at the edge of camp, the one that has been accumulating for longer than anyone alive can remember, was undercut by rising water in early spring, and a section of it collapsed into the river. Wren found mussel shells and fish vertebrae from her grandmother's time scattered across the mudflat downstream, things that should have stayed buried, things that should have remained where they were put. The midden is the camp's memory. Every layer records a season of occupation, what was eaten, what was discarded, what was burned.
The collapse of the midden is not just erosion, it is erasure. The record of who was here and what they did is washing downstream into the estuary, mixing with silt, disappearing into water. Wren does not think in these terms. He does not conceptualize his midden as an archive, but he understands loss. He understands that the place where his mother cracked hazelnuts and his father split antler tines is now part of the river, and that the river is wider than it was when he was a boy, and that the reed beds are advancing into the birchwood, and that the birchwood is retreating uphill, and that there is not much hill left. The old people talk about places that are gone. A hunting ground 2 days' walk to the southeast that is now open water. A river crossing that used to be knee-deep and is now chest-deep. A sandbar in the estuary where seals hauled out every autumn, submerged now, visible only at the lowest tides. These are not legends. These are the memories of living people describing changes they witnessed with their own eyes. Wren has his own list of lost places. A flint source on a bluff above a creek that flooded permanently 3 winters ago. A nut grove on a south-facing slope that is now too waterlogged for hazel to grow. A campsite on the coast as it was when he was 12, that is now a quarter-mile offshore, visible only as a dark stain of charcoal and bone in the shallows at low tide. Each loss is small, each loss is survivable, but they accumulate, and they only go in one direction. The question that Wren cannot answer, the question that nobody in his world can answer, is whether the land will stabilize, whether there is a point at which the water stops rising and a new equilibrium is reached, and the remaining land is enough to support his people's way of life. We know the answer. They did not. The water did not stop. Between roughly 8,000 and 6,000 BCE, global sea levels rose approximately 20 meters, an average of about a meter per century, though the rate varied. In some periods, the rise was imperceptible. In others, particularly during episodes of rapid ice sheet collapse, it accelerated dramatically. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Doggerland experienced this not as a graph, but as a lived reality. Some decades, the coast barely moved, lulling people into the belief that the worst was over. Other decades, the sea advanced visibly, swallowing familiar landmarks in a single season. Wren is living in one of the acceleration periods. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America is in its final stages of collapse, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater into the global ocean. The effect is felt everywhere, but in the shallow, flat terrain of Doggerland, it is felt acutely. A 1-meter rise in sea level on a gently sloping coast can translate to several kilometers of horizontal land loss. Wren's world is not just getting wetter. It is getting physically smaller. He has a decision to make. The western hills, the chalk uplands that will become eastern England, are higher, drier, and increasingly attractive. Other groups are already moving there. The competition for resources in the uplands is intensifying as lowland communities are pushed out of their traditional territories by rising water. Wren has heard through the network of contacts that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers maintained through seasonal gatherings and marriage exchanges that some Western groups are becoming hostile to newcomers. Flint sources are being guarded, hunting grounds are being defended. The Eastern option is different. The continental marshes, the future Netherlands, the future North German coast, are low and wet but vast. There is room. The resources are different. More waterfowl, more fish, fewer deer. A life lived in the eastern marshes would require different skills, different tools, different patterns of movement. It would require becoming a different kind of people. Or there's a third option. Stay. Adapt to the shrinking land. Move the camp uphill as the water rises. Fish where you used to hunt. Dig where you used to walk. Accept that the world your grandparents knew is gone, and that the world your grandchildren will know will be different again, and that the only constant is change, and that the land does not owe you its loyalty. Wren chooses to stay, for now. This is not stubbornness, it is rational. The land he knows, even the diminished, waterlogged, retreating version of it, is the land he understands. He knows where the flint is. He knows where the fish run. He knows the paths through the reed beds and the safe crossings at the river and the lee slopes where the wind drops and the fire will hold its heat through a winter night. This knowledge is his wealth. It is the only wealth he has. To abandon it is to become poor in the most fundamental sense, a person who does not know where he is.
So he adapts. He teaches his children to read a landscape that is changing faster than the teaching can keep up. He shows his eldest son the flint source on the river bluff and watches the boy's face when he realizes that the bluff is smaller than the stories said it would be, that the chalk has crumbled, that the best nodules are now underwater, that what remains is adequate but not what it was. The boy asks the question Wren has been dreading. Where did the rest of it go? The water took it. Where does the water come from? Wren does not know. Nobody knows. The water comes from everywhere and nowhere.
It rises in winter and recedes in summer, but each summer it recedes a little less, and each winter it reaches a little farther, and the net direction is always the same. The water comes, and it does not leave. Wren has a story his mother told him, and her mother told her. In the beginning, the land was high and dry and cold, and the great ice lived in the north, and the animals were enormous, and the people walked wherever they wanted because there was no sea to stop them. Then the ice began to die. The ice melted, and the meltwater flowed south, and the low places filled, and the rivers became lakes, and the lakes became seas, and the people moved to higher ground. And the ice kept dying, and the water kept rising.
And someday, the story did not say when, the water would cover everything, and the people would have to learn to live on the water itself, or find land so high that the water could never reach it. This is not myth. This is memory. Mesolithic oral traditions, by their nature, have not survived. But geologists and archaeologists have noted that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve accurate descriptions of coastal geography that was inundated at the end of the last ice age, over 7,000 years ago. The linguist Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nick Reed published research in 2015 identifying Aboriginal stories from multiple locations around the Australian coast that described landscapes now underwater, with details consistent with sea level data. If oral traditions in Australia could preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise across 7 millennia, it is not unreasonable to suggest that Mesolithic European communities maintained similar traditions. Wren's story about the dying ice and the rising water may be the echo of something real, a cultural memory of the transformation of Europe's geography after the last glacial maximum, transmitted from parent to child across hundreds of generations. But memory does not stop the water. Wren's second winter in the adapted camp is harder than the first. The autumn deer migration shifted its route. The animals are moving through higher ground now, avoiding the waterlogged lowlands where they used to graze. Wren's hunting party has to travel farther, stay out longer, compete with groups from the west who are hunting the same diminished herd. They come back with less meat and more tension. The fishing is still good. The estuary, as it expands, is becoming more productive, more surface area, more tidal flow, more nutrient exchange between fresh and salt water. Wren's people are eating more fish and fewer deer, more shellfish and fewer hazelnuts. The diet is shifting. The toolkit is shifting with it. Wren is making fewer microlith-tipped arrows and more bone fish hooks.
Fewer hide-scraping tools and more net weights. River cobbles notched at both ends so they can be tied to the bottom edge of a woven fiber net. The old skills are not disappearing, they are becoming less central. A young woman in the camp, Wren's niece, is the best fisherwoman in the group. She can read the tidal currents in the estuary the way Wren reads flint fractures, intuitively, unconsciously, with a precision that comes from years of observation and practice. She knows where the fish congregate at each stage of the tide. She knows which bait works for which species in which season. She knows how to mend a net in the dark by feel alone.
She is the future. Wren is the past. He knows this. He does not resent it. The land tells you what it needs, and what the land needs now is people who understand water, not people who understand stone. But Wren still works his flint.
In the evenings, when the camp settles and the fire burns down to coals, he sits by the hearth and strikes blades from a nodule he carried back from the diminished bluff. The sound, a sharp, clean crack, like a knuckle popping, is the oldest sound in his world. It is the sound his father made, and his grandfather made, and every ancestor he can imagine or invent made, going back to the time when the ice was alive, and the land was high, and the people walked wherever they wanted. The blades he makes are small and precise and unnecessary. Nobody needs them. The camp has enough microliths. The fishing gear needs bone and fiber, not flint. But Wren makes them anyway, because the making is the thing. The conversation with the stone, the statement about who he is. He leaves the finished blades in a small pile by the hearth.
By morning they will be scattered by children's feet, or swept into the midden, or picked up by someone who notices their quality and decides to keep one. It does not matter. The making was the point. Years pass. Wren ages. The camp moves 3 times, each time uphill, each time to a spot that was forest a decade ago and is now the highest dry ground available. The estuary widens, the river mouth shifts, islands appear where hills used to be, knobs of higher ground surrounded by marsh and tidal flat, connected to each other by paths that are passable only at low tide. Wren's people are becoming islanders. The transformation is so gradual that no single day marks the boundary between land dweller and island dweller, between walking and paddling, between a world defined by solid ground and a world defined by the water around it. But the transformation is real.
The children are growing up with different instincts than Wren had. They think in terms of tides, not trails. They measure distance by paddle strokes, not footsteps. They fear the spring flood the way Wren's generation feared the winter cold. The old paths are gone. The path to the flint source is underwater. The path to the autumn deer ground runs through marsh that is chest deep at high tide. The path to the neighboring camp to the east, the group that Wren's sister married into, the group that has always been their closest ally, is now a water crossing that requires a hide boat and calm weather. Communication is harder, trade is harder, marriage exchange is harder. The social network that held Mesolithic Doggerland together, the web of kinship and obligation and seasonal gathering that connected groups across the lowland, is fraying as the landscape that supported it dissolves. Each group is becoming more isolated. Each island is becoming more self-sufficient, not by choice, but by necessity.
Wren's niece, the fisherwoman, has taken a partner from the Western group, a man who arrived by boat during a summer gathering and stayed. He brings knowledge of the chalk uplands, of the flint mines and the deer herds, and the drier, higher, more stable world to the west. He talks about land that does not flood, land that stays where you put it, land that your grandchildren will walk on the same way you walk on it. The pull is obvious. Wren feels it himself. The western hills are visible from camp on clear days, a pale line above the gray water, solid and unmoving, while everything around it shifts and flows and sinks. But Wren stays. He stays because the estuary is still productive, because the fish still run, because the reed beds still shelter waterfowl in numbers that darken the sky at dawn. Because the land, what remains of it, is still his land, and he still knows it better than he knows anything else. And the knowledge is still worth something, even if the land it describes is shrinking. He stays because leaving would mean admitting that the story is over, that the world his mother described, the high, dry land, the great herds, the walks that went on forever, is not coming back, that the water has won. And then the wave comes.
We call it the Storegga Slide. Around 6200 BCE, give or take a century, an enormous section of the continental shelf off the coast of Norway collapsed. The landslide was massive. An estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment slid downslope into the deep Norwegian Sea. The displacement of water generated a tsunami that radiated outward across the North Sea basin. The evidence is in the sediment.
Geologists have identified Storegga tsunami deposits, layers of sand containing marine microfossils transported far inland by wave action at sites along the coasts of Scotland, Norway, the Faroe Islands, and the Shetland Islands. At some Scottish sites, the deposits indicate wave run-up heights of 20 meters or more. In the shallow, low-lying terrain of what remained of Doggerland by 6200 BCE, the wave would not have needed to be 20 meters high to be catastrophic. Even a wave of 3 to 5 meters arriving across a flat landscape with no high ground within reach would have been unsurvivable for any community in its path. The research on the Storegga tsunami's impact on Doggerland is ongoing.
Bernhard Wenninger and colleagues at the University of Cologne published a 2008 study arguing that the combination of the Storegga tsunami, the 8.2 kilo-year climate event, a sudden cold snap caused by the drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America, and continued sea level rise effectively ended human habitation of the remaining Doggerland landmass within a few generations of 6200 BCE. The surviving population would have been dispersed west to Britain, east to the continent, and the cultural traditions that had developed over thousands of years on the lowland would have been absorbed into the traditions of the communities that took them in. Doggerland did not fall. It was not conquered. It was not abandoned. It was subtracted from the world, piece by piece, until the last piece went under and the North Sea closed over it like a mouth closing over a word. Wren does not survive the wave. I am not going to pretend he does.
The archaeology does not support a heroic escape narrative. The communities that remained on the lowest, most vulnerable remnants of Doggerland in the decades around 6200 BCE were living on borrowed time and borrowed land, and when the wave came, there was nowhere to run that was not also underwater within hours. But here is what I want you to hold. Wren's flint blades, the ones he made by the hearth in the evening, the ones nobody needed, the ones he made because the making was the point, some of them survived. Not the ones from his camp specifically. Those are under 40 meters of North Sea water and sediment, and we may never find them. But blades exactly like them, made by people exactly like him, using techniques exactly like his, have been pulled from the seabed by fishing trawlers and research dredges and archaeological coring projects for the past century. They sit in museum drawers in London and Amsterdam and Copenhagen. Small, dark, sharp-edged triangles of flint, each one the record of a single moment when a human hand struck stone with intent and skill and something that can only be called care.
They are not labeled with names. They are not associated with individuals. They are cataloged by location and depth and typology. Mesolithic, geometric microlith, North Sea context, and filed away. But each one was made by someone. Each one was the product of a tradition passed from hand to hand across hundreds of generations. Each one was a conversation between a person and a stone, conducted in a language that required no words and left no written record and survived only in the object itself. The clean fracture, the precise geometry, the thinness that says someone cared about doing this well. The land is gone, the camps are gone, the paths and the rivers and the deer trails and the nut groves and the middens and the hearths are all gone, drowned under gray water that remembers nothing. But the blades are here. You can hold them. You can turn them in your hand and feel the edge that someone made 8,000 years ago on a piece of land that no longer exists in a country that has no name for a reason that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being human. Wren pressed flint against flint. The blade fell clean. The water took everything else. It could not take that. Sometimes I wonder what Doggerland sounded like. Not the language, that is gone beyond recovery, but the ambient sound, the wind through reed beds that stretched for miles, the call of species of water bird that may have used those specific wetlands as a primary habitat and nested nowhere else in such density. The slap of water against the hull of a hide boat, the crack of flint, the low murmur of people around a fire, telling stories about places that used to be there.
It was here.
You cannot excavate sound. You cannot pull it from a sediment core. But you can reconstruct the ecology, and from the ecology you can infer the soundscape. And from the soundscape you can begin to imagine what it was like to be alive in that place at that time. To stand on a ridge above a river estuary in what is now the middle of the North Sea and hear a world that was complete and functional and full of life and doomed. The birds would have been extraordinary. The wetlands of Doggerland in their final millennia constituted one of the largest and most productive estuarine environments in northern Europe. The combination of freshwater rivers, tidal mudflats, shallow coastal lagoons, and extensive reed beds would have supported populations of wading birds, diving birds, and waterfowl in numbers that are difficult to visualize from the perspective of modern, drained, farmed northern Europe. Cranes, herons, bitterns, geese in migration flocks that would have taken minutes to pass overhead.
The sound, in spring and autumn, would have been deafening. Wren knew every call. He knew which bird arrived first in spring and which left last in autumn, and what each arrival and departure meant for the calendar of the camp's year. The first crane meant the fish would run in 2 weeks. The last goose meant the first frost was 3 days away. These were not superstitions. They were observations, accumulated over generations, verified by experience, encoded in memory, and transmitted by example. All of that is gone. The birds still migrate across the North Sea, but they fly over open water now. They do not stop. There is nothing to stop for. The reed beds are 60 meters down. The mudflats are buried under marine sediment. The estuaries have been replaced by a featureless gray expanse that fishing boats cross in hours, and that Wren's people, if they could see it, would not recognize as the place they lived.
Doggerland is the oldest cautionary tale about the impermanence of land. We think of continents as stable. We think of coastlines as fixed. We build cities on the assumption that the ground beneath them will remain ground. Doggerland reminds us that this assumption is a bet and that the odds change when the ice melts. The ice is melting again. Not the same ice. The Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets are long gone, but the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet are losing mass at rates that glaciologists describe as concerning, and the global sea level is rising at approximately 3.6 millimeters per year as of the 2020s, faster than the 20th century average and accelerating. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that by 2100, depending on the emissions scenario, global sea levels could rise by half a meter to over a meter. Some projections accounting for possible ice sheet instabilities suggest even higher figures. These numbers sound abstract. They sound manageable. They sound like a problem for engineers and policymakers and future generations. But Wren would have heard similar reassurances if he could have understood them. A few millimeters a year, a few centimeters a decade. Nothing dramatic, nothing you would notice in a single lifetime. Except he did notice. He noticed the creek that no longer dried up,
The midden that collapsed, the flint source that drowned, the path that became a waterway, the hill that became an island, the island that became a memory. Millimeters add up. They added up 8,000 years ago in the North Sea basin, and they are adding up now along the coasts of Bangladesh, the Marshall Islands, South Florida, the Netherlands, and every other low-lying landscape where human beings have built their lives on the assumption that the ground will stay. Doggerland is not a distant curiosity from deep prehistory. Doggerland is a preview.
The last thing I want to tell you about Wren is this. In his final years, the years before the wave, he taught his youngest daughter to knap flint. She was 9. She was left-handed, which made the teaching harder because Wren had to mirror his movements and rethink his angles and unlearn habits that 30 years of right-handed napping had made automatic. He did it anyway. He sat with her by the hearth evening after evening and guided her hands on the hammerstone and showed her how to read the grain of the flint and how to feel the moment just before the fracture when the stone tells you where it wants to break. She was not good at it, not yet. She was 9, but she was patient and she listened and she kept the blades she made, even the bad ones, the ones with hinge fractures and uneven edges and clumsy platforms, in a small leather pouch tied to her belt.
When the wave came, the pouch was on her belt. When the water took the camp and the hearth and the midden and the ridge and everything Wren had ever known or made or loved, the pouch was with her. I do not know if she survived. The archaeology cannot tell me that. The water is opaque and the sediment is deep, and the individual lives of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are, for the most part, irrecoverable. But I know this. If she survived, she carried the knowledge west, to the chalk hills, to the dry land, to the world that was coming next. And if she did not survive, the knowledge still survived, in other hands, in other camps, in other children who learned the same craft from other teachers who carried the same tradition. Because that is what Doggerland left. Not monuments, not texts, not cities, a way of working stone that persisted across northern Europe for millennia after the land it was developed on ceased to exist. A technique refined on ground that is now the bottom of the sea, taught to children who grew up to teach it to their children, who grew up to teach it to theirs, in an unbroken chain of hands and hammerstones and sharp-edged blades that stretches from the drowned lowland to the living world. The country is gone. The knowledge is here. Wren pressed flint against flint. His daughter watched. The blade fell clean. Somewhere under the North Sea, beneath 40 meters of water and 8,000 years of sediment, there is a hearth, and around it, scattered by the current and buried by mud and lost to every technology we currently possess, there are flint blades made by a man whose name we will never know, for reasons we can only guess, on an evening in a country that no longer exists.
They are still sharp. They will always be sharp. That is the story of Doggerland. Not a story of a civilization that fell, a story of a world that sank, slowly, patiently, indifferently, beneath the accumulated weight of meltwater from ice sheets that had been dying for 10,000 years. The people who lived there did not fail. They did not make mistakes. They did not anger their gods or overextend their empire or lose a decisive battle. They simply lived on land that the planet had decided to reclaim. And they adapted until adaptation was no longer possible. And then the water took them. And their blades are still in the mud, waiting. If you are standing on a beach in Norfolk or Lincolnshire or the Netherlands, and you look out at the gray North Sea, and you feel something, a pull, a weight, a sense that the water is hiding something, trust that feeling. It is a country, a people, a life, right there, just under the surface.